Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vidya Natarajan, and I have the honor as the co-chair for the Center for Creativity at King's to welcome you all to this afternoon's Distinguished Lecturer event. We are co-hosting it with the McIntosh Gallery. As you know, all of you are long-term friends of the McIntosh, but we are also delighted to welcome you all here to King's. My co-chair, Dr. Jim Zucro, is in the audience, and he joins me in welcoming you all. The Center for Creativity at King's does some interesting arts programming every year. It's part of our mandate to bring together students and staff and faculty here at King's and the London community, the larger London community of artists, but also of people who support the arts, together in events that either are actually art events or, equally important, events in which art gets discussed or critiqued. And today's event is one such. So I'm delighted to welcome you once again, and I'm going to call on the next speaker, who I believe is bringing greetings from Western. This would be Dr. Janice Deakin, the provost at Western and vice principal academic. When you listen to her speak, be aware that she's been elected one of the 100 most powerful women in Canada. So I'm quite awestruck as I pass the mic over to her. So welcome all.
Thank you, Vidya. And of course, on that note, I'm indebted to my colleagues at Western for such a great nomination to attend such an inspiring event of women in Toronto. And I said I'm somewhat cynical. I'm an academic, so of course I'm cynical. And having gone to spend a day, it was truly inspirational. So that was a very fun day. So thank you, Vidya, and of course thank you, James, for inviting me again to be part of the McIntosh celebration. It's become an annual event for me since I've been at Western. This is my 5th year. I love coming to any event that the McIntosh hosts, and I like this one in particular. As I said to some of you, and I say to many of my colleagues, the McIntosh is a gem in my portfolio. I love all my children, but I love the McIntosh in a very special way. No, I can't say I love them more. I love them in a special way. So let me start by saying to you, our friends, how immensely grateful we are for your continued support of the McIntosh. You help preserve and strengthen this very unique treasure that is, of course, part of Western. I think I've said every year, I remind all of us that the McIntosh is the oldest art gallery that's affiliated with a university in Ontario, and we certainly believe it is the best. And with the renovations of our space and the wonderful shows, I think any of you who come, you would be hard-pressed not to agree with me. And of course, your support helps us move the McIntosh forward. So I have lots to thank you for, and of course I have lots to thank the leadership of the McIntosh for. Since James' arrival to be the director and chief curator of the McIntosh in 2010, he has done really a fantastic job in working on the profile of the gallery with some of you. It's become a platform for social and cultural engagements through a range of audiences, and so our students are more engaged, and of course the community's engaged. And that's why, following a review of James and his portfolio, I was delighted to announce in early February that James has been reappointed to a 5-year term. Second 5-year term. And so this is the first time I've been able to say that publicly, so please join me in thanking James and congratulating him. And now, of course, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce another leader and influencer of the McIntosh. As most of you will know, Judith Rogers served as the acting director of the McIntosh from 2008 till 2010 when James joined us. She continues to serve as an adjunct professor in our Department of Visual Arts, and she's a member of the McIntosh Gallery Committee. She is also a generous donor and a distinguished curator and a researcher who has contributed immeasurably to the cultural life of London and of Canada through her many exhibitions and publications on contemporary art. Please, joining us to formally introduce this afternoon's distinguished speaker, please join me in welcoming Judith Rogers. I didn't take your talk, Sarah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Janice, for that thoughtful introduction. Here I am on the 104th International Women's Day, privileged to be bracketed by two extremely distinguished women, Janice and Sarah. Before I talk about Sarah, I would like you to join me in congratulating Janice. As you've heard, she's just been named one of Canada's most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network. Janice has been particularly supportive of the McIntosh Gallery, and for that I, and I'm sure all of you, are extremely grateful. Please congratulate her. I first met Sarah in the pages of Canadian Art Magazine. Then I met her in person when we worked together with Dennis Reed on the 2001 Greg Curnow exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Through the years, I have been struck by her thoughtful, readable art criticism that always shows a certain amount of insouciance. How did she develop this style? She had an early introduction to art and artists through her mother, who opened the Equinox Gallery in Vancouver in 1972. At the time, Arts Canada magazine took note. Quote, "Another new gallery of extreme elegance, though small, is Elizabeth Nichols' Equinox. It has entered the field with a determined professionalism. It handles the work of about 35 artists, including such prestigious figures as Albers and Soto, top Canadians like Jack Bush, and a smattering of BC artists. This gallery, still in operation today, went on to foster the careers of many Canadian artists with national reputations. More recently, Sarah has contributed to 3 books on artists associated with the Equinox Gallery: Gathy Falk, Mary Pratt, and Fred Herzog. I think it's no accident that 2 out of the 3 are women. Sarah moved to Montreal to attend McGill University and then did graduate work in English at Cambridge. By 1982, she was in Halifax. While visiting the Dalhousie University Art Gallery, she discovered by chance in the basement an exhibition of works by Paraskeeva Clark. Impressed by the paintings and drawings, which were poles apart from the Canadian landscape tradition, she had an article on her experiences accepted by Canadian Forum. Some of you may remember that very influential journal. Hired as an editor at Canadian Art in 1984, she went on to become the publisher and editor in 1991. At the same time, as a co-founder of the Canadian Art Foundation, she had helped to ensure the survival of this important publication. As an editor, she had the chance to work with artists, critics, and scholars, observing how they approached a work of art and how they structured their writings. These years of reading informed her later writing practice. Tellingly, her first issue that she edited featured an essay titled, "Why Art Criticism is Hard to Read." In 2001, just as the Greg Curnow exhibition was opening, she told me that she had been hired as a staff art critic for the Globe and Mail. She continued in this role until 2010, traveling across the country and further afield to, as she said, become a maker alongside the artists that she covered. She thought of herself as making her own exhibition in readers' heads, realizing that many of us might not ever actually experience the exhibition except through her. Since leaving the Globe and Mail, Sarah has continued as a Toronto-based critic and writer, contributing to Canadian Art and the Globe, as well as the Walrus, Border Crossings, and the National Post. She has also contributed essays to many scholarly catalogs, including Winnipeg Now, Jack Chambers, Fred Herzog, and Chimpton Treasures. Her most recent incarnation is as a curator. Today marks the closing of the exhibition that she co-curated at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in the other London, Emily Carr and the Indigenous Art of Canada's Northwest Coast. There is an accompanying publication, From the Forest to the Sea, Emily Carr in British Columbia, co-edited by Sarah, with essays by her and 12 others, artists, scholars, and anthropologists. This groundbreaking exhibition opens at the Art Gallery of Ontario on April 11th. Mark your calendars. In her first editorial for Canadian Art in 1991, Sarah wrote, "In this first issue, you will find not only moving and thought-provoking works of art, but also writing that is lively, imaginative, passionate, and intelligent." She has remained true to this credo, only now it is she who is doing the writing. Her criticism, to quote Rebecca Solnit, seeks to travel within the work and its ideas, to invite it to blossom, and invite others into a conversation that might previously have seemed impenetrable, to draw out relationships that might have been unseen and open doors that might have been unlocked. Ladies and gentlemen, our most distinguished lecturer for 2015, Sarah Milroy.
I'm really pleased to be here today. It's always great to get to London. It's been my kind of other home away from home in Ontario for some time. I grew up in Vancouver, just one of the reasons I have such a soft spot for Emily Carr, but have lived most of my adult professional life in Toronto. But for one reason or another, I always seem to end up being tangled up with London, and worked, as Judith so kindly pointed out, on the Chambers show and the Curnow exhibition, which meant frequent trips here and visits to Western Road, which we'll get to later, and to Greg's house. And I've always been very moved by this strong sense of community here in London. And in many ways, I've always seen London as kind of having qualities of self-possession and regional pride that Toronto would do well to emulate. There's a way in which London loves its own history and tells its own stories and is loyal to itself and its roots in a way that I think sometimes Toronto struggles to achieve that. And I think Vancouver is very much like London in that regard, and Montreal is very much like London in that regard. And I suppose it's just the catalytic presence of a few exceptional individuals that sort of kick-started the idea of regionalism here and regional pride and identity, or just the sort of incandescent imaginations of some of the artists who have blossomed here. But whatever is in the drinking water, it's good stuff. So I was talking to my husband last night about the talk that I'm going to give today, and the fact that it was called Wayfinding in the New World. He said, "You are giving a talk about wayfinding?" That is, that's pretty funny, because I can't find Yonge Street from Bloor Street. And indeed, I ended up in Arva this morning, which is lovely. But I realized when there were farmers' fields for 5 minutes on either side of the road that maybe I'd overshot the mark. So wayfinding, in a way, is not really my area of expertise, but perhaps not surprisingly, thinking about wayfinding has become a bit of an obsession in the course of the last 3 years working on Emily Carr, because I think one of the things that Carr's paintings open up for us are questions about how we belong as settler Canadians, which is now the new accepted term for people who are not Indigenous Canadians, how we as settler Canadians come to occupy this place called Canada imaginatively and in every other way. And I think Carr had a lot of complicated feelings about belonging to Canada, and as I will outline, had some very unique reactions to those conundrums that she expressed both in her writings and in her art. So I'm going to read a little bit, just so I don't leave any good stuff out, and then I'm going to freewheel a bit when we're talking about the specific works that I'm going to show you. So, Wayfinding in the New World. Let me see, where do I wave my magic wand. It seems to be not responding. Yeah, the little forward button. And it's reluctant to accommodate me. There. Did you do that or did I do that? You did that. Okay, so I'll just ask for next slide. We'll let's see if the pointer works, okay? Just a little tech check here. It does. There's a totem pole. Okay. I want to start with a few words about punctuation. Not that it's the most exciting topic in the world for most people, but the idea of the new world. I called the talk Wayfinding in the New World with inverted commas, because as anyone who has Indigenous heritage in this room might immediately feel, the idea of the new world is new world for us settlers, but of course not a new world if your family has fished and trapped and traveled over these lands for millennia. And if your forefathers and your foremothers, if we can use that term, have known the land, tracked it, lived off it for centuries, but then there are all of us who've come here from other places, whether it's England, Korea, Dubai, Bangalore. Canada is in fact just one giant arrivals hall from coast to coast, but this arrivals hall sits on top of a deep foundation of Indigenous habitation, a foundation that has been rendered all but invisible. This is how the writing of history shapes awareness. A flurry of short paragraphs at the front of the book about the millennia of Indigenous habitation before there was a Canada to be a part of, and then the brief and glorious, quote, history of us, with the cap H and U. Now, the more intelligent and subtle-minded have seen Canada differently. And as I mentioned, I've been working for 3 years on Emily Carr, preparing From the Forest to the Sea, Emily Carr in British Columbia, which, as Judith noted, opens on April 11. Carr was that most unusual of frontier imaginations, really without parallel in her time in Canadian culture and without much parallel since, in fact. She is emblematic to me of a settler imagination that must struggle here to find a place. Of course, in retrospect, her work is also emblematic of the modern condition in general, not just the Canadian one. In modernity, the moving migrations of mankind, particularly after the shattering of colonial empires, these great migrations between continents and ways of life and being are moving faster and faster. And in 1 or 2 short generations, we're losing a fundamental sense of connection to place, which was once the heritage and habit of our species. Carr wondered over what was lost in that shift to a kind of homelessness, and what of the imperiled rootedness of those we have attempted to displace. It was interesting, I was talking about this idea with Kent Monkman, the Cree artist, Cree, Scots, Irish, etc. artist, the other day, and he said, well, it's not that we don't belong anywhere, it's that we belong everywhere. And I think that is the global reality that we experience, but it's curious to me, we think of gender as being the great, I think many of us feel that gender is the great shift in the past 100 years, the redefining of what it means to be a family or what it means to be a man or woman. But the other great shift that's occurred is that we don't belong to a place. We're not raised where our grandparents were raised necessarily. We don't live our lives and then get buried, in the village. And of course, there were human migrations always throughout the history of humanity, but the accelerated rate of change means that we have this kind of alienated relationship to the places where we find ourselves living. It's not at all uncommon for people to spend their lives on 3 different continents. And I think Carr, this was, the hallmark of one of the hallmarks of modernism, but I think Carr had unusual sensitivity to that, and I think that was part of her attraction to First Nations people. Unusually in her time, Carr was troubled by this question. She herself was an inheritor of British intellectual and literary tradition. She was raised in colonial Victoria by her 2 British immigrant parents, and boy, do we mean British. A steady round of Sunday school, British romantic poetry, those daffodils haunted her imagination, roasted leg of mutton on Sunday and custard for dessert, room temperature, of course. The garden was a display of English marigolds and rose bushes, and though she was born in Canada, people remembered Carr as speaking with a British accent, just ever so slightly, part of that colonial pretension to belong to the old world. Though we have no recorded sound of her voice, her speech was littered with old chaps and Cheerios, and you get that when you read her journals, that she was lapsing often into this kind of parlance. Yet she found herself on the western edge of empire, displaced from the British mothership of her imagination, adrift in what was to her imaginatively most certainly a new world, even though she had been born here in Canada. So faced with this challenge, she broke ranks with her kind, though, and here was her genius of perception. Underpinning the colonial project was the assumption that Aboriginal people needed to be civilized, that they required improvement from the white example. Carr felt precisely the opposite, that it was the colonials with their air of superiority and heartless arrogance who required the civilizing. And Carr had observed the ways of Indigenous people at close hand wherever she was able, seeing and admiring how they raised their children in a sort of non-punitive, non-violent way, how they interacted with the land and natural resources, what she saw as their knowledge and subtlety in social relations, the high value placed on integrity and honesty. She noticed and was a beneficiary often in her life of their generosity and hospitality. And she also observed at the same time the assumption of racial superiority of her own tribe, if you will, the greed, the ignorance, the belittlement. And Carr felt it was we settlers, of course, who needed to be civilized. And in her writing and in her art, she struggled to find a way to land here, to find a place, to navigate what was for her a new world. And she knew that she had to come to that deeper, truer understanding of where she was through an encounter with Canada's First Peoples. And of course, you know, other artists, think of George Catlin or Paul Kane, had depicted Aboriginal settlements and artifacts and so on, to use that loaded term. But often it was, one of the things I noticed working with Carr is that often they would do so from a high and lofty vantage point of surveying. And it's really quite notable to me, this is a perfect example, the Forest and Totem, how frequently Carr puts herself underneath things looking up when she's in these communities. It's as if she's really making herself subject to a kind of weight of precedent, weight of history, visually putting the viewer down at the foot. And that's a completely unique formal solution to the problem of painting these kinds of objects. I'm going to show Totem and Forest to you from Carr and also Indian Church in a moment. But I first wanted to just sort of pinpoint Carr's prescience. She wrote, "I glory in our wonderful West, and I hope to leave behind me," speaking in the parlance of her day, "I hope to leave behind me some of the relics of its first primitive greatness. These things should be to us Canadians what the ancient Britons' relics are to the English." And of course, that was a very radical statement in her time, but it's also a very vexed statement, but of course, because of course these were the relics of a great civilization of the Haida, not of white Canadians. And so there's something kind of missed in her formulation, and yet the spirit behind it is obviously, shows great wisdom and empathy. A totem pole is a marker of belonging to a place and entitlement. It's how one's history and one's identity is embedded in a landscape and in the system of clan identifications in the natural world. The painting that Carr makes is a work of art, but as is the pole. But for Carr, the painting is a sort of site of reckoning. And this particular pole, I'll just quickly say, Carr saw on the mainland it had been moved from Hillel, which is Toe Hill near Masset. It had originally been an entrance pole, and then it was moved for display to be more available to the growing tourist traffic on the coast, to another location. And this actual pole belonged to the family of the Edenshaws. And so Jim Hart, who was my consultant on the First Nations loans that we had in the show in London, just happened to mention to me, this pole is my family's pole. And his reading of this painting was all about his family and the Bear Mother story and his own clan identity within the Haida. So when we did the show in London, we showed this painting with the audio of Jim talking about his family. We also found in the archives the holdings of the British Museum and Pitt Rivers and so on, many objects that had been given, surrendered, commandeered, one never really fully knows, by his family, including some objects that had been given to missionaries in the late 1800s that were from as early as the 1600s. So it certainly changed the way I look at this painting, because normally when you look at this painting you think about European traditions of Cubism and, you know, Carr's sophistication in terms of her relationship to European painting traditions, and Jim's take on the picture was like a revelation to me and so fascinating. Let's go to the next slide. It's the wonderful Indian church, which is at the Art Gallery of Ontario. This painting was acquired by Lauren Harris from Carr, and he had it in his living room in Toronto, and would always talk about how it was the best painting that Emily Carr ever made, which used to piss her off royally. I've done many much better. That you couldn't give a compliment to Emily Carr without her biting the hand that fed her. So that was typical of her. But it was in fact, you know, one can kind of intuit why she was uncomfortable with the praise, because it is very much an outlier in her oeuvre, in that it's a painting of a European-style building, the geometric composition of the white church, set against these kind of curving vortices that are derived both from European and American Cubism and from the kind of monumental carving that she'd seen on the coast. And one of the catalog contributors, Jessica Stockholder, who's a Vancouver-born, now internationally acclaimed artist who lives in Chicago and runs the art school there, wrote one of the essays for our catalog, and she saw this really as a painting about two ways of seeing and being coming into contact, that the curve representing for her the kind of curves we see in the totem pole painting that we just looked at, representing a more organic vision of nature where nothing is a straight line and things are cyclical and things are understood to be in constant rotation and regeneration and renewal, versus the rectilinear geometric, which she sees as a very European way of organizing experience. And she sees the sort of picture frame as being related to the way that land is cut up into segments in European. So we all know those maps of Montreal where there's those lines that go back from the river and these parcels of land which then become iterated into streets later on, and that kind of initial DNA of that first contact ends up being part of the city plan going forward. Hundreds of years later, those traces are still there. But I really liked what she had to say about the curve and the straight line in this painting. We should say also that Carr, this particular church is in Yuquot, which is also known as Friendly Cove, the northwest, I got this right? Yeah, northwest part of Vancouver Island. So it's really a very remote location, and it's actually where Captain Cook first set foot on British Columbian soil in 1778. And there's a monument to Cook there, and there's a legendary tale that Carr went on her trip to Yuquot and refused to go to the Cook Memorial because she said she had better things to do with her time. And she made the sketch, which is now owned by a businessman in Vancouver. And as soon as she got home, she made Indian Church. So there was that defiance about, you know, whose history are we honoring, and what's actually the most important thing to look at here. Is it where a European first put his foot on the soil, or is it maybe perhaps the civilization that flourished here for millennia? So this is part of the wisdom and the wonderful thing about Emily Carr and getting to know how her mind works. It becomes an infectious way of seeing and thinking. The next slide is for something completely different. We're hoping. It's a slide of a Vancouver artist named Damien Moppet. And in fact, this is Damien himself in the attire of a pioneer woodsman, prospector woodsman. And Damien, you know, like Emily Carr, is a third-generation artist, and I think a first-generation Canadian. Both his parents, Ron Moppet and Carol Moppet, who are artists out west, came from Britain, and before them, Ron's parents were also, father was also an artist. So, you know, Damien, rather, like Emily Carr, is kind of coming out of a very English household, and is, I think, in this work, which is called 1815 to 1962, and I'll explain why in a minute, but, you know, in this work is really, I think, this is a piece about imaginative possession of the landscape, or situating yourself as a person of European extraction in the natural world in British Columbia. It's one of my favorites. It's a 15-minute long video in which you see Damien in his wonderful long beard, which he grew for the occasion, and his like open cloth shirt, costumed, as I said, as a kind of prospector, and he's wandering around in the rainforest in what seems to be early morning, and it's sort of misty, and he has a hatchet in his hand, and he's sort of sussing out the territory, and he stops at one point and starts to build something. And at first, you can't really tell what it is he's up to. And of course, in true video art fashion, it takes a long time before we understand what it is he's doing. But it turns out that he's making something that looks in the end like a kind of animal trap. And yet, it's also like an odd-looking animal trap. It arouses one's curiosity because it doesn't really conform to what we think of that being. It turns out what it actually is a replica of a work of modernist sculpture called Early One Morning by the British modernist Anthony Carrow, who was a British artist that I think Damien had a very strong kind of inspirational relationship to. Felt that he was like working against this tradition of British sculpture that Carrow's a part of. So to me, it's about taking a visual language from the quote old world and rooting it in the rainforest of British Columbia. And it's always been one of my favorite pieces. When it's shown in a gallery, usually the video is unfolding on a wall, and then in front of it is a balsa wood replica of the Carrow sculpture. So when you look at the Carrow sculpture replica, you can tell you're looking at something that looks like art. So a clue is given. It's not quite as hermetic a work of art as it might sound when I describe it. But as I say, I think it's a piece about experiencing the frontier from a European frame of reference and how we bring our traditions with us and apply them in these new contexts that we find ourselves in. And also, in a way, like the Indian church, it's about that inserting a planar geometry, rectilinear geometry, into a context that's organic and living and unstructured. So I see it as a kind of a much later iteration of some of the themes that Carr, I think, is, whether consciously or unconsciously, working with in Indian church. We could take the next slide, please. So the question of wayfinding also comes up in the work of the Vancouver artist Landon McKenzie, and I understand that Landon was just talking at lunch with someone who was explaining that Landon has a London connection. She also teaches at Emily Carr, so it's all a woven tapestry. Landon is related to Hugh Mackenzie, who was a very important art teacher here, and she's come to be a very important art teacher in Vancouver. Many students that she has changed with her powerful imagination, and she made a whole series of works called Tracking Athabasca in the 90s, and there were about 20 in the series as a whole, and they were generated out of profound, long, deep spells of research that she ended up doing in the Saskatchewan archives and also at the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge, and trying to really grapple with this question of how do we kind of get ourselves into the landscape here when we're newcomers. And like Carr, she had this kind of sense about that. And in fact, Landon just did a very beautiful show. I think it's still on at the Vancouver Art Gallery if anyone is traveling west, where she kind of interrogates Carr and shows some of her work alongside Carr's. And it was a very beautiful experiment. I was lucky enough to see it a couple of weeks ago when I was at West. But this particular painting is called Tracking Athabasca. Make it to thy other side, but it's mack it to thy other side, because this was a phrase that she borrowed from her daughter, who had been going to Sunday school with her mother and was a funky speller. And Landon just ended up grabbing something from her daughter because it seemed to her to be about generations and time going by and investing in place. The Land of Little Sticks, she mentioned to me, was not, as we thought, about small trees on the tree line. It was actually a game that was played by Indigenous people from the northwest coast all the way across, which involved little kind of gaming sticks. So that was what the land of little sticks was. But she found this note describing this part of Athabasca region as the land of little sticks in one of the old maps that she found. And she looked at hundreds of them and kind of pulled together these hints about things that had happened there, experiences that had occurred to people, people's personal impregnation of the landscape with memory. Some maps were official, some maps were personal that she looked at. And she just, decided to engage in this sort of fanciful journey into that. And so what you see here in the middle is written, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but it says, after a draft of the Nelson and Hayes River, and then it rambles on, we can't quite make it out. But it's the Nelson and Hayes Rivers run westward out of Hudson's Bay, which wasn't called Hudson's Bay then, I think it was maybe called Button's Bay, Button being a man who came looking for Hudson after he was, after there was a mutiny and he was voted off the island, as it were, or voted onto the island, rather. But she's put scraps of writing that she's found. You can see the tree line there that's designated with the little trees below it. These black holes, which for her represent kind of terra incognita, the way that there are these gaps and openings and omissions that for her are so tantalizing, and which a lot of history writing and history making tends to kind of smooth over. And she was really interested in opening those spaces of wonder up, so people would understand what really how inconclusive our histories are, and how there were so many more ways of understanding what had happened in the past in Canada. And in the course of making this piece, I just talked to Landon about this work this week again. I phoned her up in Vancouver because it'd been a long time since we'd talked about this piece. And she reminded me that she'd done the work in collaboration with a woman named Doris Whitehead, who was a student of hers at Emily Carr, who desperately needed some work. And so Landon gave her the job of creating with her the grid that is behind all these other decorative elements that have been laid over top of it. And the grid was painted in Indian red, ironically enough, paint. And then they'd put the masking tape down, then they'd paint the grid with the Indian red, then they'd have to peel and pick the masking tape off. So this was the job that Doris came in to do. And then in the course of it, of course, Doris's family had been her own life had started out in Uranium City, which is in the Athabasca region, which is north of Lake Athabasca, which is way up there. And as they did this work together, they actually started incorporating some of Doris's story. Doris had grown up in Uranium City. There had been a terrible history of family violence. Of course, she inevitably becomes involved with drugs and alcohol, has a child, loses her daughter, migrates, gets involved with prostitution, and somehow ends up finding her feet again, becomes a poet, becomes published, ends up in art school as Landon's student, gets clean, gets her kids back, and starts to build a life. And so there are little elements from Doris's story that are woven into this painting that is also constituted of all these official and unofficial histories that Landon had gathered together. So for me, it's like veil upon veil of stories being told in one place. And of course, the more you try to know something, the more elusive, the more knowledgeable you become, the more inconclusive your feeling of actually mastering that thing become. And to me, this painting is about that kind of humility that comes from deep research and the kind of curiosity that was aroused there. A sort of a striking and very sad note to this story is the yellow is the kind of international symbol for toxicity. And it turned out that they had this idea to put these yellow marks on the painting because of the uranium mining. And it turned out that 2 weeks after they finished making this painting together, Doris died of an undiagnosed stomach cancer that was probably caused by the toxicity in Lake Athabasca which she had imbibed throughout her childhood. And she had these symptoms of pain which had been dismissed by doctors because of her her history, and doubtless because of her racial identity. So I think that this is one of Landon's most important paintings in her view, and I think it is. I think it is as well. So maps. So we have a great map maker coming next as well. One of the fieriest map makers in Canadian art. None other than, next slide please. Oops, wait a minute. Greg Curnow, where did his map go? Can you go forward a little bit? Keep going. There he is. Okay, we're gonna have to back up to the Deeds Abstracts work. But this Greg Curnow's America, I mean, this is just a masterpiece. And in fact, Greg used to show at my mother's gallery, and so we grew up with him dropping in and out of our house, and which was fantastic because he was just hilarious and wonderful and a great friend to my mom. But here you can see Curnow's like revisionist treatment of North America with the United States missing, and of course, close the 49th parallel was his battle cry, and I'm sure this annoyed greatly many Americans who have made wonderful contributions in not only in London, of course, but elsewhere in Canada. But it was an absurdist position that he took in order to make a point. I mean, then as now, Canada was very busy trying to ingratiate itself in partnerships of trade and really giving over a lot of sense of its own cultural identity to Americans, and there was great defiance being expressed in the cultural community about leadership of some of the institutions in Canada sitting in the hands of Americans who were coming here. And even though, of course, I think he would probably also say that, when Vietnam shook the tree, all the best apples landed on our side of the fence. I think he felt that way. But what I love here is that Toronto does not make the cut, but Pelee Island does, and Nain in Nunavut, what is now Nunavut. So there's a kind of, you see Queen Charlotte Islands there, so he's Emily Carr's soulmate in that regard. But it's a kind of way of trying to figure out how to protect a space. And for him, Canadian space, Canadian identity, Canadian culture was such a precious thing, and he felt it was so under assault from the great enthusiasm for all things American in his time, and he really struggled, of course, as we all know, to assert regionalism and to the sort of preciousness of local culture. If we could back up to those, these text works. This was Greg's real genius work, and it was from the very last period of his life. Of course, he died in 1992, tragically, in a bicycle accident. And I actually spoke to Greg about a week before he died, strangely enough. I had seen this Deeds abstract work at Winnipeg Gallery, as it then was, at 80 Spadina. And it was all shown. There were about 8 of these large pieces there, and some smaller works on paper as well. And I was just flabbergasted by them. What it was that Greg had been doing some sort of mucking around in the garden with Galen and the kids, and had come across an old lithography stone. And he figured out, he was a curious guy about everything. He was an incredible autodidact, whether it was boxing or it was, jazz or whatever it was. Anyway, this became his big passion is, where did this lithography stone come from, and what did this place used to be, and what's Weston Road? Like, why is it called Weston Road, and who lived here before me? And of course, he found out that there was the Knowles lithography studio, which you see there, and then the Saunders comes after. I believe that Curnow's come after Saunders, but I'm not sure. Judith would probably know off the top of her head. But it goes back here through the title holders to the Crown. So he did this series of work that really, interrogates how we come to own a place and how we're entitled to it. But if we can go back one more to this bright blue one, of course, he takes it all the way back. He follows the natural logic, as does Carr, sort of understanding you can't really know where you are if you don't, look all the way back to the beginning. So this beautiful piece, which I think now belongs to Winnipeg, goes back to Paleo-Indian. And I just wanted to read a little bit actually from this fantastic book, Deeds Abstract, that was published in '95, 3 years after Greg died. But let's see if this is going to put this down so it doesn't fall. Just to give you a bit of a feeling of Greg's sense of revelation, because it's actually, when you read this book, it's not only, sad because he died, it's sad because it's so clear that Greg had found something after a couple of years of having a tough time after his retrospective and kind of wandering in the wilderness, that he'd found something that really was giving his life an incredible driving sense of purpose and meaning, which was doing this research into the First Nations habitation along the Thames River Valley and so on. Human occupation, Greg writes, of this area goes back much earlier to the Paleo-Indian sites and pond mills or the Ingersoll moraine. Tonight, Saturday, February 15, Neil Ferris told me more. Okay, now this is very typical of Greg's way of writing history, is that he never asserts anything to be true and then just footnotes it. He always foregrounds in the writing the way in which he gathered the information, which is, he kind of granulates history as a way of working against any kind of idea of a master narrative, because I think he quite, obviously very intelligently understood that master narratives are suppressive narratives. And he wanted to make it clear that everything he iterated as being a fact was only someone's version of the truth. So Neil Ferris told me more about Bob Calvert's discovery around 1947 of pottery fragments and other artifacts from a Middle Ontario Iroquois site circa 1400, where Foxbar Creek joins the old bed of the river. The site is about 300 meters from our house, behind the Moose Lodge at 6 Weston Street. Other nations occupied this area after the Neutrals, with the present Ojibwa occupants arriving after 1690. So one of the things that happens here is that he's very clear in Deeds Abstract about the movement of Aboriginal people and the shifting habitations, because there's a sort of a habit of mind that there's our settler history, and then before that it was like Aboriginal people lived here, as if that was one thing, and he was very scrupulous and studious about breaking that up, again, granulating that. Other nations occupied this area after the Neutrals, with the present Ojibwe occupants arriving after 1690. On June 22, 1790, at L'Assomption, now Windsor, in the district of Hess, 7 Ojibwa, 13 Wyandot, 8 Odawa, and 6 Potawatomi chiefs drew their totems on surrender 2. They received 1,200 pounds worth of goods in Quebec currency for surrendering all of southwestern Ontario, south of the Askunasippi, Thames River, or Rivière de la Tranchée, to the Crown, King George III. Surrender 2 had as its eastern limit a line drawn from near Dorchester on the Askunasippi south to Catfish Creek, Rivière aux Chaudières, at Port Bruce on Lake Erie, so it's very, detail picky. When I read a copy of that document, I began to be aware of spheres of influence that operated in this area in 1790. They survive today. It's a long-distance call from London to Putnam, 25 kilometers. It's not a long-distance call from London to Glencoe, which is 50 kilometers. So he goes on to write about, how these kind of the pentimenti of the surrender treaties are still sort of inscribed in the DNA of how we organize ourselves in settler society, but that we have no awareness of where these forms came from, and he made it his business to kind of pull that back into view. So let's see the next slide after our map. Okay, so this is another kind of map in a way, and it's Curno's View of Victoria Hospital second series. And in a way, I mean, it's a landscape and it's not a landscape. It shows the area around the hospital and the hospital itself. And if we think of the Bear Mother totem pole as being an object that tells stories and has stories and histories embedded in it, it seems to me that View of Victoria Hospital second series is a work that is all about taking this modernist monolith and the lands around it, and taking kind of imaginative ownership of it through the infusion of human memory and experience. And thus we have, like, itemized on the painting moments from the life of the artist and his circle, births and deaths, and fleeting incidents. Most of them are fleeting incidents that wouldn't be by any historian be seen as important, but that's part of the Curno thing. Fleeting incidents of lived life that adhere to the bricks and mortar, anchoring it. And Curno records weather conditions, light effects, bird movements, the presence of his friend Jack Chambers, his father's final illness, the birth of his children, all with precise time and date inscriptions. So for example, this work in fact came, as you can see, with a little tape player and a text, a little book of mimeograph sheets that correspond to the numbers that are on the screen. So you can look up what's number 46 and what's number 3. And when you look them up, they might say things like, Sheila points out the room where she had Galen, October 8, 10:30 p.m. So that's not necessarily when she had the child, it's when she pointed the room out. Dirty snow piled higher than ever, seen out back. February 12th, 2 p.m. Or car tracks in the grass made by our Austin 1100. I wish I'd known the story behind that one. August 20th, afternoon. So there's a way in which he's like trying to express a sense of belonging, and that sense of belonging is something that comes out of having experiences in a landscape, in a place that you, as I say, you kind of impregnate the site with your own personal history or that of your family. And I see that impulse as being, quite kindred in terms of a human yearning to what we see when we look at some of the things that Carr was recording. Again, as with the Deeds abstract works, there's a kind of interest in granulating history and vernacular history and the things that are not seen as heroic deeds, but rather of just lived daily experience. And in this, I think this is really the precursor to the great late works that I showed you just a minute ago. So if we could have the next slide. Colonel's great buddy, rival, friend, Jack Chambers, the 401 tours, London #1. When we did the Judith will remember when we did the Curnow exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario, I was in charge of rummaging in the archive. And one of the things I found, which was just like from heaven, was an envelope from a photo developing shop that had all the photographs that Chambers had taken that fateful day when he was driving towards Toronto, but he caught a glimpse of this landscape, allegedly, in his rearview mirror and had a kind of epiphany of homeward bound and the curve of the land and the beauty of this moment of being that he was having. So he pulls the car over and jumps out, and what we had in this envelope was all the Polaroids he took. And it's really kind of terrifying because he's clearly running back and forth across the highway with his Polaroid camera, and you can see, oh, here comes the truck, click, and then you see, the back of the truck, and it's he's obviously in this kind of frenzy of excitement in this site, trying to figure out what vantage point to take it from, and where he eventually ends up is on the overpass, is the Woodstock exit, looking at the highway. What are the things that were rejected on the way to deciding on this image? And what was rejected were a whole range of roadside pictures, and also pictures in which the sky was, less prominent. So the two major formal decisions are to be up high and to feature so much of the sky. And I think both those decisions do the same thing, which is to kind of show us a contrast between a sense of the landscape as something eternal. Like one of the dynamic things about this painting is the way it slopes gradually down to the left-hand side. And that is, it's this kind of prow of land that has obviously been, eroded away by some retreating glacier, millions of years ago. And I think it would be it would feel very different, this painting, if that horizon was flat. It also, I think that sense of geological time there is a kind of almost like memento mori, or it calls to mind the fact that the fleeting moments of daily life, such as driving down the highway late for your meeting or getting lost in Arva, as I almost did today, allow us to sort of lift ourselves out of an awareness of what the land really is that we're on, what's really happening in a physical sense around us. So for me, like the man-made line of the highway is kind of in dialogue with the geologically formed curve of that horizon, and the two of them are in a kind of beautiful calibrated relationship to each other. And also the sky. I mean, Chambers made a lot of spectacular paintings of skies. It was one of his real strengths. And I think for him, I mean, he was a very devoutly religious man. I think it did have a very spiritual aspect to it. And again, I think it was a kind of reminder about the things that he felt were the fundamental realities of human experience. But it is also like it's a whole new kind of landscape painting in the history of Canadian art, because it's not about wilderness. It's really one of the first major works of Canadian art that's really about traversing a tended landscape, and about our kind of slender hold on the landscape here. And I also think, you know, there's this dialogue, it's 401 towards London, but he makes it when he's going to Toronto. So I'm fascinated too by the titling of it, because, you know, he wasn't driving. It is a view looking back to London, but it was made doing just the opposite. And I think for Chambers, there was always this, Toronto in those days was considered to be, you know, the Isaac's All-Stars, and that's where the money was, and that's where the collectors were, and it must have exerted some kind of gravitational pull. But there was this very contrary assertion of being, you know, connected to a place where he had been born and grown up, and, you know, this being his kind of ultimate statement of belonging or yearning to kind of connect with a particular place, a particular landscape. Can we have the next slide, please? All right, so from the sublime to the not ridiculous, but let's say comic world of Jason McLean. And of course, you've always been, you've all been lucky to see Jason's work here at McIntosh when his beautiful show happened. And I was lucky enough to be asked to write in the catalog. Thank you very much for that, James. And Jason, you know, in that great tradition following Curnow, is really fascinated by movement and rambling, and of course he wasn't a bicyclist the same way that Curnow was, but they are sort of soulmates. And I picked this work because, like Chambers' work, it has the 401 in it, this big gray sort of bloated slug-like thing in the middle with this curious figure sitting on it. It says dream on the back. And what's happening here is that Jason is, you know, in London, but thinking about Toronto, which is the gray route, but then also thinking about Buffalo. So if you look over here, there's New York City, and then there's, you know, references to Buffalo over here, and then of course this is Toronto with the CN Tower, and up here it says blue, what is it, highway. It's the Neil Young quote. I can't actually read it from here, but it's the quote from Helpless, Neil Young's song. So it's about kind of, you know, expat, it says here, slippery when wet, you know, more highway stuff. It's really about, you know, how do you find your place, like where do you belong, and the sense of that being kind of provisional. And, you know, Jason's made a lot of work that has really extolled London, and one of his more endearing qualities is to refer to London, Ontario, as LO, as opposed to LA, Los Angeles, or certainly as opposed to London-ing, you know. He's always talking about LO, which I just think is fantastic. Or TO, of course, is the other one. But, you know, what gives me pause here is that it's also a record of a kind of somewhat colonized imagination, in the sense that this American sort of Shangri-La over here that is tempting him, and he is now living in the U.S. actually, but we hope we're going to get him back in Canada someday soon. But being kind of somehow the real deal is south of the border, and of course this is, you know, this is a kind of attitude that that Greg was dealing with in his time. But Jason is, you know, loving being rooted here, and the other works within this period, you know, extol the Wortley School and his favorite coffee shop near there, and the library and the people that he loves in London. But there's this sort of sense of, yes, he's committed to belonging here, but it's only shallow roots, and it's always about, is this really the right place for me to be? And I could actually, you know, as Kent Monkman says, we belong everywhere, we belong nowhere. And I think that this work by Jason is like a perfect perfect sort of iteration of that, and it's one of my favorite pieces that he made. There's little delivery trucks down here whipping around. I don't know. It's got a lot of charm, and I think that that Neil Young, I mean, nothing really sort of hammers home a sense of Canadianness like the work of Neil Young and that voice, and a lot of Jason's work has quotations from Neil Young in it because it's a particular favorite. So, as I said, we could see this as an update to Chambers' vision. It depicts a sense of being between things. In Chambers' case, it was between London and Toronto. Here it's being between London and, Buffalo or New York or who knows where. Being between things, being suspended, being in a kind of hectic and unrooted state, yet still striving to attain a state of connectedness to place, so coming and going. And I just want to close by saying, that this country, if people I think of sensitivity understand, we've come to live here, but this is not yet really, truly, fully our place. And, as people in settler culture, we kind of skitter over the surface of the Americas like water spiders. And the conundrum is, though, that we've really got nowhere else to go. It doesn't really, Europe is not really home for many people. India is not really home anymore, or Turkey or China or wherever they've come to Canada from. And so this is our conundrum as settler Canadians and as human beings generally, in the modern moment. And, as we traverse time zones and continents and nationalities at a faster and faster rate. And I think Carr and the artists in Canada who have come after her have started to show us how we might think about this fact more deeply and maybe even come to belong here, even just a bit. That's what I have to say. And thank you so much for your attention. And I don't know if there is provision for questions or dialogue today, but I'm happy to talk to anyone about anything with regard to what I've said here today. Thank you so much for your attention. Are there questions or thoughts? No questions or thoughts. Okay, yes?
I'll say something. Down at Victoria Hospital at 4:30,
Yes.
people are trying to preserve the old hospital.
Today?
Yes.
Oh, how extraordinary.
And so seeing that slide was really informative.
Well, I had, it's interesting you mentioned that because I had heard that the hospital had been torn down. And,
Well, there are 4 sections of it. So
yeah.
still, they're trying 4 buildings. They're still trying to.
Well, it's interesting because people feel, the hospitals are places where the real big stuff happens in lives, And I think a lot of people have very emotional associations with hospitals, but as places of loss, but also of birth, and there, big events in the community happen there and in people's personal lives. So I can see why there's a lot of. It's not the most beautiful building. It's what's interesting is that people are fighting hard to save it, even though it is, but not the loveliest, But both Greg and Jack Chambers had a real fixation with that building, and of course, as many of you probably know, they both. Jack did a version of the Victoria Hospital as well, which was an absolute opposite of Greg Curno's. It was bleak and desolate in a sort of wintry landscape, in that kind of, like, dare I say, kind of like today, except without sunshine, that time of the year that's an absolute nadir of energy. And he didn't know when he was making this painting that he had leukemia. He was diagnosed after the painting was well underway, if not completed. Judith could correct me on that, but.
I can't remember, but Greg and Jack actually painted the 2 paintings in Greg's studio.
Side by side in Greg's studio, yeah. And yeah, it was the view from the roof in Greg's studio. And so it was a kind of, we find our landmarks where we can, right? In a way that the urge to preserve that hospital speaks to what I'm talking about, which is, that we are nomads, and we search to find ways to anchor ourselves in a new world for us. And, I don't know how old that hospital is, but it's a pretty new part of the topography to command such fierce loyalty. But it speaks to that human need to
They're going to be building new townhouses and apartments down by the river, but the fight is to keep two buildings to sort of anchor that space.
yes.
Amidst the new.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very fortuitous that that's happening today. I think we should all go straight over there after a cup of tea. But are there other questions? Thank you for letting us know that. Yes, and please bellow so we can hear you.
I have a question about the work you showed us by Landon Mackenzie.
Yes.
And you mentioned the importance of Dorothy. I'm sorry, I can't remember the other name.
Let me just double check it. It's Whitehead, I think.
A naive question.
Yes.
But you talked about Dorothy providing both the visual framework for what was happening and some of the conceptual framework of what Landon was doing.
Yes.
Is there a way in which Dorothy is either the or the co-painter of what happened? Because that sort of...
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, in terms of providing the framework, the grid on the back, I mean, it's very customary for artists to have studio assistants that would do like mechanical things, like we need a grid here, you know, and it's, you measure it with a ruler and you put the masking tape on. But in terms of like why Landon did not call it a work by Landon Mackenzie and Dorothy, you know, Whitehorse, like I can't answer to that except to say that she always is at great pains to credit her whenever she talks about that painting. And the work is now in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. I think what happened is that work, the mark making, I believe, on that canvas is all Landon's, but the narratives that they both brought to it, both from the research and from Dorothy's life, were from both. So I think I would assume, because Landon is pretty progressive in her politics, that's why she ends up calling the piece her own work. But she is at great pains to tell anyone who will listen about how this thing came to be and the story of this woman's life. I should say also that that Dorothy's family history is quite interesting, because apparently Simpson, who was the head of the Hudson's Bay, had more than 22 illegitimate children during his frolicsome journeys across Athabasca. And so on that painting, the little white curlicues that are kind of in the upper reaches of Athabasca are apparently sort of ejaculatory gestures that Landon and Dorothy came up with, because it turns out that Dorothy is descended from him. She's one of the hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal people from that region who are descended from Simpson, who was a bit of a character. I was reading up on him this week, and kind of an extraordinary person. But no, it's a very interesting question. Thank you. Yes.
I was rather struck by what you said about Emily Carr's perspective being from below and her being sort of looking up at
Yes.
the landscape. I wonder if you noticed there was a pattern in how you set up your artists, and when you have the Colonel Victoria Hospital pieces are exactly at eye level, and then except for the Landon Mackenzie, which is a bit of an odd piece.
Aerial view, yeah.
The Chambers picture is an aerial view. And this one I find fascinating because I think it's all about being up and being down as well. Because I see the whole thing as a snakes and ladders.
Yes.
So
It has an almost nightmarish quality of not being able to situate yourself in conventional space. You know, you're kind of underneath things and above them at the same time. That's really interesting. No, I wish I could lay claim to that brilliant idea that you just had. But no, this is just fortuitous. But I think a certain characteristics of like disturbed or interesting spatial derangements is not inconsistent with the kind of ideas that are behind these works. I think it's understandable that there would be something very specific spatially about the way Chambers would tackle this subject, or very specific about Curnow. I mean, in Curnow's case, it is, you know, wanting to make a picture that is exactly his own particular lived experience of that view from his place and his particular spot in the world. You know, he was always about, you know, like could carry around a teaspoonful of dirt, you know, from underneath his house. I think he would have, you know, was just really obsessed, even I'd say, with that issue of rootedness and trying to find a way to be rooted.
but it's interesting too that the final image that you ended up with, the Jason McLean image, suggests
Yes, exactly, exactly. And a way in which this theme in Canadian art is actually a theme of all art after the modern, the post-colonial period and the modern period, because of course we're all migrating and have been migrating since leaving the southern part of the African continent. So, this is the human condition. It's just that we're in this moment in the last 150 years, say, of just cyclonic acceleration in terms of this. And I think, I've come to think, like looking at Carr, who is a kind of eco-feminist, before there was such a term, really understood, I think, intuitively that, you can authorize environmental degradation somewhere else, somewhere that's not your place. And that one of the reasons that people can do that is that they're not doing it in their own spot. And that this unrootedness is also contributing to our ecological demise. That sense of loyalty, belonging to the land, we just don't have it. On that depressing note. But we can fight for it, and Canada's Indigenous people can help us to get our thoughts in line on that. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your attention, and this has been great. Thanks.
Speaking of strong and smart women, it's an honor for me to come after and to serve with people like Janice and Judith. With all due regard to my own sex, I'm just a little happier and a little more at ease when I'm working with strong, smart, powerful women, and the world would certainly be a better place. We don't need to finish that particular statement. I love the fact that Sarah presented us with a strong, smart, creative woman who looked at the world as it was, as it is, and as it could be, and inspired so many incredible people who came after her. Sarah, that was a wonderful talk. And it makes me just a little happier to be in this impossible place that we call London, Ontario. I'm glad I'm choosing to stay here. I want to thank Vidya Natarajan and Jim Chuchero, co-chairs of the Center for Creativity, for providing this incredible space for us to have this distinguished McIntosh lecture for 2015. This really is incredible. This is my first time here, and it's just beautiful. I'll be returning, and I'll be bugging you to use it, I can assure you. I also want to remind us of the David Rokeby and Maurice Stubbs opening reception Thursday, March 19th at 7 p.m. I hope to see as many of you there as possible. And on behalf of the McIntosh Committee, I simply want to thank you for your continued support now throughout the year and hopefully in the future. And I'll look forward to seeing many of you again. Thank you for coming out today. Spring is almost here. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.